Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us again this week with another lesson in the Word. We're following the International Sunday School lessons as they trace through the book of Genesis. And we've looked at some of the opening chapters with the creation stories and got us up now to the point where we're focusing on God's work through individuals, people like Noah and Abram, and we're about to come to Abram's son Isaac. So, David, glad you could be with us.
Good to be here again.
Glad we're here together talking about these great stories from Genesis. And the stories about Abraham are just rich experiences, aren't they?
Really are. Yes.
They're so foundational in our study of the Old Testament. And turns out they're important for our understanding of the New as well.
It's hard to get a full understanding of the New Testament without this background of the Old, and Abraham and his descendants are the Old Testament.
That's right. That's right. Last week we were looking at that major turning point where God has been working with the human race, but the human race has been getting worse and worse and worse, and now it's almost as if God shifts strategies by focusing on this one human being through whom he will bring about a means of redemption for the human race. And so this time we go on to see some of the fulfillment of the covenant promise that God made with Abram. He promised that Abram would be the father of a great nation, and that depends on something, doesn't it?
he's supposed to have children, but he doesn't have any.
Yeah. So here Abraham is almost 100, and Sarah is almost 90, and so today's lesson talks about the birth of this promised child, Isaac. And I'll just say ahead of time at the beginning here, this has some important implications for us Christians too, in our understanding of Jesus, God's Son. And I hope we have time at the end to make a brief mention of that. But for now, let's talk about the story of Isaac. Now, we've skipped a lot since last week, haven't we? We were in chapter 12. We start today in chapter 18. Let's quickly talk about what's been happening to Abraham and Sarah.
There's a lot that took place between there. After chapter 12, Abraham and Lot separated. Lot chose the valley, and Abraham took the high ground. And
then Lot got in trouble.
Then there were these invading kings, and they raided and kidnapped Lot and his family, and a lot of plunder, and took off. And Abraham organized 318 armed men from his own servants to pursue them, which indicates the wealth of the man.
It indicates the wealth. It also indicates something about the actual occupations that he pursued. These aren't just simple shepherds who've been stumbling around Canaan following their sheep. They are a little militia force who are prepared to go off and fight some Mesopotamian armies. Which suggests or kind of confirms this notion that Abram runs a caravan business, which would have employed guards. So his servants are guards, and they're used to trouble.
It's a possibility.
Like this.
At any rate, they pursue those kings, bring back Lot and the plunder and so forth. But then there's another covenant renewal.
Chapter 15, we've skipped actually two very, very important chapters, chapter 15 and then 17. There's a covenant renewal, God reminding Abram that he has promised a son, which is the grounds for this great nation. And then chapter 17 is very important because there we get not only the repeated promise of a son, but several other important elements in the covenant relationship. Part of it has to do with names, doesn't it? Yeah.
Abram's name is changed to Abraham.
Yeah.
Sarai's name is changed to Sarah.
And there's the instruction of what they're to name this child of promise, this son.
And when God tells Abraham now,
Yeah.
that he's going to have a son, he laughs so hard he falls on his face.
He cracks up and he rolls around in laughter. You're going to have a son? So the name that's given to this son, even before he's conceived, is laughter.
Isaac. Right.
Which means laughter. And so, which describes Abraham's reaction to learning that he's actually about to have a son. Well, that brings us up to chapter 18, where our lesson is today. But our printed lesson begins at verse 9, and we ought to set the background of this.
It might be good to mention also that prior to this, in chapter 16, Sarah came up with the idea that since they didn't have a child, Abraham should have a child through her handmaid, who would be a surrogate and would be a child they could call theirs. And so Ishmael was born to the handmaid Hagar.
Mm-hmm. Abraham has a child, a son,
right.
Ishmael, but he's not the child of promise, even though Abraham thinks. And this is an interesting example of how Abraham and Sarah are people of righteousness. They're people who have put their faith in God and trust God, but at times they're impatient with God bringing about his covenant promises.
Yeah.
So they try to take matters in their own hands, or they try to protect themselves. Like when they went to Egypt back in chapter 12, Abraham pretends that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, and they get in big trouble.
It was partially true, but it
partially
was also
true. Yeah, of course, many of our lies are partially true, aren't they? But then the one you're talking about has to do with deciding that there's no way that Sarah is going to bear a child, so Abraham will impregnate one of her servant women, and her son by her would become the child of promise.
And in chapter 17, when the names are given, God says you're going to have a son. He said, surely, Ishmael could be.
He said, "Oh well, you don't need to miraculously cause Sarah to have a child. I've got Ishmael. Let's just make him the child of promise." So Abraham, like all of us, sometimes try to cooperate with the will of God, but also take matters into our own hands. And so, thank you for reminding us of that. Well, when we get to chapter 18, it says that 3 men arrived at the nomadic settlement where Abraham and his servants and all these people are living in a tent community in their semi-nomadic existence there. And Abraham immediately goes into Near Eastern hospitality mode.
Right.
Yeah. What's involved with showing hospitality?
He insists they stay, and then immediately tells Sarah, make some bread, and tells the servant, kill a calf, prepare a meal. And
before they do any business or discuss anything, they first have to have a big meal together. And that's very typical of Middle Eastern hospitality. So Abram was a man of his time. We don't exactly, well, it's not that we don't know who these 3 visitors are, but the description of them is downright confusing.
It's shifting and changing to the point where it's hard to, who is this?
At times it sounds like there are 3. At times they're referred to as 2. And then there's 1 sometimes who does all the speaking. They are called men. But then at what point the one of them is referred to as the Lord.
The Lord, and it's the Yahweh name.
Yeah, it's not just a word for master. It's the word for their distinctive name for God. Later on, people looking back on this event think they might have been angels. At any rate, there's a lot of confusion connected with that. And here, we've mentioned it now, but we're not going to belabor that.
Yeah.
And we're not even going to try to solve it, are we?
Right.
Yeah. What's important to me is that these people come as messengers to Abraham about what's going to happen according to God's will. And whether they're humans or angels or one or two or three, what's important is that God's will gets communicated once again to Abraham. Well, that's what lies in the background of these verses. So let me read here, starting at chapter 18, verse 9, and then the lesson text jumps over to chapter 21. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." And now jumping to chapter 21, verse 1. "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Well, once the meal was over, once hospitality had been satisfied, they get down to business.
Yes.
And once again, the business starts with a telling question. Where is Sarah? Where is your wife Sarah?
Yeah.
Because she was going to have an important role to play in the development of the future.
But she wasn't at the meal.
Oh, that's a good reminder. In fact, this whole passage shows us that women had a relatively secondary role in ancient Near Eastern society. And this is one of those examples, right?
Yeah.
She had to fix the meal,
right?
You said that
she was
told
bread.
She had told to go and make the bread. But she doesn't get to sit at the table with the men folk. I can remember back when I was a college student, not that many years ago, right? A few years ago, when I was a college student working as a youth minister at a country church over across the mountain in North Carolina, that we would go home with one of the elders of the congregation for lunch after church, and his wife would cook and cook and cook while the men folks sat and the elders showed the hospitality to us in the living room. And then when it was time to come to the table, we came in and sat down, and his wife never sat down. She brought the food and then disappeared for a little while, and then came back and cleared our places, and then brought dessert, and she never did sit down at the table. It was very, very odd for me. Well, so here's Sarah listening away from the table at the door of the tent. And of course, when she hears this, she almost can't believe.
She laughs.
Yeah, and she laughed. Now, should we blame her for her laughter?
We've already seen Abraham on his face laughing.
Thank you for reminding us that back in chapter 17, when this promise was first made, This is just a renewal of the promise. When it was first made, he fell flat on his face in laughter. So no, I don't think we should hold this against her. She's laughing out of the way we do, out of surprise. She at least was trying to control it. It says she laughed to herself.
Yeah.
she's not rolling around in laughter the way Abraham was.
But she was embarrassed about it.
Yeah. Now but back to what you were talking about, the role of women here. They don't even come to the table. They have to fix the meal. They don't come to the table. We have some other evidences of the secondary role here as well, because this child is born to Abram, right? Abraham. Isn't that the language later on?
Give him a child in his old age.
Give him a child. In a sense, it's not her child. I mean, it is, but this is all for Abraham.
Yeah.
So he has a child. She nurses the children, but I have borne the child for him. Yeah. Well, so we get the laughter. Now, besides the laughter, is this question in verse 14 here?
Yes, that's a key question.
How should we understand that? Is anything too hard for God, for the Lord?
Yeah. And there are no limits on what God can do, and you know, it still boggles our minds to think about a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having a baby. But the same question: is anything too hard for the Lord?
It's probably a question that all people of faith need to consider over and over again, right? Just like Abraham and Sarah, they're people of faith. They're very deep faith.
Definitely.
Abraham believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He's a person of faith. But even he has a hard time imagining God accomplishing some things that we think of as impossible.
Yeah.
And I know I'm in that situation today. I think I'm a person of faith, but you know, could God really do that, or you know, accomplish that? The word hard, I looked up, literally means wonderful. That is full of wonder, an occasion of wonder.
Too amazing.
Yeah, amazing, even tending like to the miraculous. So is anything too miraculous for you to imagine God accomplishing? Which is probably a question that we ought to at least rhetorically ask ourselves periodically. The timing issue here is so interesting, isn't it? In the earlier promises, it's always way off in the future. You will have a son, or, you know, you will have a son. But here, it's
next year.
It's
next year.
Next year. Yeah, this time next year.
Yeah.
So at the appointed time. So it's no longer a promise to be put off into the distant future. It's imminent now.
Yeah.
It's about to happen.
And it fulfills what the covenant in chapter 17, where the names had been changed and the name Isaac had been given, and circumcision was established as the sign of the covenant.
Yeah. Our viewers really probably owe it to themselves to go back and read chapter 17. Because we did in preparation for our discussion of this lesson, and just look back one chapter, because so many important things happen there. The Son, the promise of the Son is reiterated. The names are changed. The name of the Son is given, and then circumcision. Okay, well, you brought that up. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of circumcision in this whole story.
Well, it was something that was traceable back to Egypt and was apparently known in the Middle East at that time. And whether it was done for health reasons or whatever, it became the symbol and the reminder of the covenant relationship God had with Abraham and his descendants, and becomes the sign down through the generations, even into modern times, of the people who've come from that Hebrew heritage.
Right. Covenants frequently have signs associated with them that kind of symbolize or stand for or remind us of the covenant. Sometimes it's an action, sometimes it's an object. I I think, a handshake is kind of a sign of a covenant. If we make some arrangement, we don't have to shake hands.
Yeah.
We can just say, okay, I'll pay you that much for your car, and you say, okay, I agree. Well, that's the covenant.
Yeah.
But then we symbolize that agreement with
a lot of people have talked about,
act.
we don't have a written contract, we had a handshake.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, a written contract could be the sign of a covenant. And back with Noah, I think there are kind of two covenants made with Noah, each of which has a physical sign. The famous one, the one that we think about a lot, is the rainbow that comes at the end of the Noah story.
That he will not destroy the earth again.
Right. That's a covenant related to future behavior of God, and the rainbow is a sign of that. But at the beginning of the Noah story, which we studied recently, God says, I'm going to have you build an ark. I'm going to give you instructions for an ark, and that will be your means of salvation. And in a sense, the ark stands for and symbolizes God's saving involvement in human existence. I mean, it saves the human race.
Yeah.
So there's an object, an ark, that accomplishes that. Here we have a physical action, circumcision, and that is instructed to Abraham back in chapter 17, and we're about to see it enacted. Now, he's already circumcised his other male servants and everything.
Yeah.
So it's not that Isaac's circumcision was the first circumcision. No. Abraham immediately started using circumcision of males as a sign of the covenant relationship he had with God. But we're about to see the important one. Okay, anything else in
We skipped over
18?
chapter 19, which was Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh,
discussion.
right.
When the three messengers or two messengers or the Lord were there talking with Abraham about the promise of Isaac, then God sort of debated whether to tell Abraham about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham bargains with him, haggles with him over destroying the city. If there are 50, 40, 30, down to 10 people, God agrees if there are 10 righteous people, he'll save it. Well, there aren't.
Yeah.
So the city's destroyed.
Yeah.
And
but Lot is rescued.
Lot's rescued, and his wife and daughters are brought out, but the wife turns around and becomes a pillar of salt.
Right.
And in chapter 19, that's chapter 19, chapter 20 is when Abraham journeys over to what later would become Philistine territory, and Abimelech, the king, he tells that lie again about Sarah being his wife, or his sister.
Yeah, not being his wife.
Yeah.
So even though Abram has been in regular communication with God, and his special covenant relationship with God has been renewed over and over and over again, he still tries to manipulate circumstances towards self-protection and to kind of almost forcing the hand of God to accomplish his will. So,
and the impatience with timing, the birth of Ishmael, it's part of that trusting God.
Something you pointed out a couple weeks ago about Noah was that even though he was righteous, doesn't mean he was morally perfect.
Right.
And we could, I think, say the identical thing about him. Well, let's look at this passage then in Genesis 21. The Lord fulfilled his promises to Sarah. It says he visited her, he cared for her, he was gracious to her. And big emphasis on fulfillment of promise there.
Right. As
Sarah becomes pregnant and bears a son. Abraham follows God's instruction in the naming of Isaac, and then follows God's instructions with circumcision on the 8th day, which was the customary time. And then we get emphasis on on Abraham's obedience. Yeah. And then this verse 6 in chapter 21 is delightful. God has brought me laughter.
Yeah.
That has kind of a double meaning, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, because Isaac means laughter. And so God has brought me Isaac, God has brought me laughter.
It's delight.
Delight, joy. It's a lovely statement. And then everyone who hears about this will join me in my delight.
Laugh with me.
Yeah.
Not at me, but
Yeah,
with me.
yeah. They could have laughed with her. What's this old lady doing? A pregnant 90-year-old lady? That's kind of a Ripley's Believe It or Not or something, but not for her. It's just an object of divine delight.
Yeah.
And I like that about Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's quite lovely. And then verse 7 ends, who would have thought?
Yeah.
Who would have thought this? Yeah. Well, let's think about some of the ways in which this story touches us as Christians as we wrap things up here.
The son who's born, the next chapter talks about God calling eventually for Abraham to sacrifice that son.
Yeah, the very next chapter, 22, is this near sacrifice of Isaac. It's so interesting there that in chapter 22, verse 2, Isaac is referred to as your only son, your beloved son, which is exactly the language that's used of Jesus in some of the most crucial events of his life in the gospel accounts. That's the language at the baptism of Jesus, and it's the transfiguration of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
And so whenever we see that phrase, that Jesus is the beloved Son of God, or the only Son of God, our minds should go back to Isaac, which was the other place that language is used. So even at the baptism of Jesus, there's kind of a foreshadowing of his sacrifice. I mean, Isaac was rescued from being sacrificed. Jesus was not.
Right. Yeah.
And at the baptism and again at the transfiguration, that phrase, beloved son, speaks not only to God's relationship with Jesus, but also to the upcoming sacrifice. Yeah. That's a really good point.
There's some big lessons in this birth of the promised son, Isaac, because partly it's a matter of patience with God's timing. We can sometimes get so impatient that we want to hurry things along and move without God.
Yeah.
We have to trust him and his timing.
Another thing that's so beautiful here is that, frequently we beg God to bring about his will in a way that blesses us. And Sarah gets a major blessing here. She's longed for a child and finally receives one. But then sometimes we don't pause after we receive the blessing to celebrate it and to be as thankful as we should. And the way Sarah pauses and says, God has brought me laughter, and then kind of invites the whole world to delight.
The joy that's there.
Yeah, to delight in the work of God in her life. And I think maybe we need to work on ways to do that, not to brag about what God has done through us, but to just invite people to celebrate that with us.
Name our children laughter.
Yeah, maybe we should do that. Well, that's, I think the name Isaac is coming back.
It is. It's becoming more popular.
It's more popular, and maybe with really good reason.
Yeah.
Well, we're so glad that you could join us today as we talk through this very important moment in the life of Abraham and Sarah. And let me invite you to, with us, use it as a way of remembering God's only Son, God's beloved Son, Jesus, and the difference that his sacrifice makes in our lives. We hope you can join us next week. In the meantime, have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.